Right. Good afternoon, good morning all. Welcome to this IriusRisk webinar called Banking on Security, Why Threat Modeling is a Solid Investment. And I'm your host, Stephen de Vries. I'm the co-founder and CEO of IriusRisk. And I'm joined by two titans of the threat modeling world. Jeroen Verwoest, who's the threat modeling product owner at ABN AMRO. Jeroen, would you like to just a quick intro to yourself?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, product owner for threat modeling, meaning I develop and implement and position threat modeling for ABN AMRO and standardize it. We're doing it since 2018, just a reminder of that. And happy to work on it and still happy to do it in the future as well, in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeroen. Great to have you with us today. And I'm also joined by our let's call him a repeat resident on IriusRisk webinars, Jason Nelson. So Jason is the founder and principal consultant of Necessary Security, a consulting services firm focused on helping people do threat modeling. In his previous roles, Jason's also run threat modeling program for a major US bank. Jason, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, thank you very much. So as Stephen said, focus primarily on threat modeling and helping customers kind of take that journey, whether it is entry or further you along in your progression into high maturity and capability. Spent a lot of time in finance and healthcare and consulting, so threat modeling has always kind of been part of what we've been doing in reducing risk, identifying threats. But the formalized process, I think I've been involved in, less time than you're in, but but happy to keep going and help working with people now. So
awesome.
I'll take lead from him on whatever he says.
Super, thanks, Jason, and great to have you back. Just one note on the housekeeping. So we will do a kind of let's call it a formal Q&A at the end of the discussion between Jeroen and Jason. But if you did have any questions as they come up during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try and act on them as we go, so we can keep this a bit more live and dynamic and keep it interesting. So let's start off. This is all about banking and threat modeling in a banking environment. What makes threat modeling in a banking and a highly regulated environment different to doing it elsewhere? What were the key things that you guys think are kind of unique to doing it in a banking environment?
Shall I start or shall you start, Jason?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll kick it off. So when it comes to being in a very regulated environment, and I think this will, those of us who are in those environments will understand and feel along, is that it's all about rules. So we create a rule because a rule can be monitored, can be followed. And based on that rule, teams are expected to do things, to take requirements. And what happens if you do this for a very long time, like ABN AMRO has been around for quite some years, at a certain point in time, you don't understand what these rules mean and what they are. So when you introduce something like threat modeling and actually bring back, so why do we have this rule? Why do we need to secure? What can actually happen when it goes wrong? That is 9 out of 10 a real eye-opener, especially for these developer teams who are just tell us what to do and we'll start doing it. Even if it's a lot of work. And of course, there will be pushback, as in, this will take a lot of work and a lot of effort, and they need to go live. But we have a rule, and if you explain the rule through threat modeling, bring them on along that journey, they will start to, understand why these rules are there and why they have to secure the systems, but also make better decisions around them, which to accept, which not to accept, which rules to bend, which to really strictly follow. Yeah, and so that's for starters, and of course it's the lineage. Why did we do the thing that we do? Not just because we made a rule, but also because it has an actual purpose.
Yeah, and I think that certainly the threat modeling as a more kind of a technical activity, it can bridge that gap between a high level requirement within the regulation into, well, how do I as a developer, what do I specifically need to go and do to implement this rule?
Exactly.
And you know, just get down from that high level into something that's a bit more tangible and technical for technical audiences.
I think the regulators globally are starting to codify in their language in the US, in Euro region, in Asia. They're really starting to formalize threat modeling as a risk or threat identification process and its requirement. So I think that's where a lot of the financial institutions really need to take note of, even if they haven't started already, or maybe they have some level of risk management process, they have red teaming, they have SOC, they have things like that. Typically those exist as a post-deployment or post-action response. And what the regulators are really coming up to define is get ahead of that. As you're architecting, as you're developing, define and work into that early on the requirements you already have, meaning we want you to encrypt things this way. We'll use that pattern. Don't invent a new way. Or I know that these threats exist because of threat intelligence feeds, because of experience or other things like that. Don't do these things again, and then work it into your process. So threat modeling, you know, has been around for quite a while. I recently did a blog kind of trying to prepare for this to get something out into the world of like how long threat modeling's been around. And people have responded to that saying, wow, that's, you know, early 1900s, that's pretty crazy. But it was a military construct. But it's transitioned like many things. We used to say kill chain, but that's not acceptable anymore. So we talk in different terms now, not military construct terms, but we talk about that. And like MITRE ATT&CK is an example of things that have transitioned. So that's fine, but the regulatory requirement is still loose, and I think that leads people to be confused and not know exactly what to do. But the value of listening to the regulators, getting ahead of it, even talking to the regulators, say, well, what are other banks doing?
Yeah.
And that can help them a lot. So it's definitely a solid investment if regulators around the world are starting to codify it.
Yeah.
And let's maybe dig into that in a bit more detail in those kind of different regulatory areas. So, you know, in the US, so Jeroen from a Dutch bank and Jason, you know, mostly from the US perspective, what do those two geographies look like from a regulatory perspective as it pertains to threat modeling? Like, what are the things that are driving European banks to do threat modeling, and what are the things driving US banks to do threat modeling?
Well, when it comes to making the link to regulations, it was GDPR that actually started out as saying you have to be very early on in your development cycle or in your your creation cycle. You need to understand the risks. So it was more focused around the risks. So what the risks are there around PII data. PCI DSS mentions this, but now DORA is really jumping on top of it, and they say you really have to have a structured process where you upfront understand your threat landscape, but also can show how you respond to it. So not only from external understand, okay, we've looked at the internet, we've scoured the dark web, and we know what's happening with all the other companies, but also internally, where does this land internally? Where do you introduce your threats with these new products and these new functionalities, and how do you respond to them? So you have to build a rationale on your decisions when it comes to security requirements. And they can't just be anymore, yeah, it's because we made a rule. You know, it should really have there is a threat, and we are minimizing that threat, and from this threat will come a risk, and this is how we approached and handle it. And I think DORA is now becoming one of the major drivers, making threat modeling actually being mentioned as one of the products that we should implement.
Just on that, so we always run into this issue of the naming of things, right? And some people call it threat modeling, and some people call it architectural risk analysis, and some people call it threat assessment. And What does DORA use as the terminology? Is it?
I think it was threat assessment. They
Threat
do
assessment,
threat
yeah.
and risk. Yeah, they mentioned risk assessment in a couple of articles, but I think there's one article that actually says threat assessment needs to be done very early on in the design phase.
Yeah.
And
it's I think the interesting thing about DORA is it's not just the financial institutions themselves that need to comply. It's also, you know, if you're a provider or you're considered like a critical supplier, you also need to comply with DORA.
Yes, exactly, and that it really kicked off at the beginning of this year. As you probably will already have noticed yourself, because even the whole third-party suppliers and even their suppliers, they need to be, you know, compliant to DORA, and the one that actually receives the services need to make sure that the whole chain is compliant, or at least, you know, has a grip, and need to understand what the situation is. Broadening the scope, and then you go outside of just understanding, okay, I have bought a application or I use a SaaS solution from a certain supplier. So not only on a technical level, but also on a contract level, you need to understand, okay, is everything in order? So suddenly threats, breaking the law, you know, having threats coming from a third party, laterally also needs to be taken into these assessments as well. Broadening the scope of your threat model to, well, I have an application and I want to see the threats, to, okay, what's my landscape look like, and who is interacting, who and what is interacting with that landscape on different levels. So that's that's really now the point.
And Jason, what does this look like from the US regulatory perspective?
I think this is one where the US has been slightly ahead as far as just the amount of language.
Ironically, the US ahead in terms of regulation. That's a shocker.
Well, we could make some jokes about how our entire security complex at the government level is being shut down systematically, but I won't take it there.
That's a different webinar.
That's it.
But where we're at and where we've been, so the FFIEC is a body in the government that basically tells other entities that regulate financial industry how to audit. And so they write prescriptive playbooks and they give training. And so for me, when it was my responsibility to make sure the bank I was at could get out from a consent order, I would go and read how the auditors are trained so I knew what questions would be asked of me. And so when you look at the OCC, the FRB, the FDIC, and a few others, they all may, because they're individual entities and individual people, operate slightly differently, but the effect is the same. The rules in the playbook are the same. They have been given prescriptive guidance to assess how there is a threat or risk identification process.
Yeah.
Threat modeling is mentioned in newer language when you look at NIST, when you look at CISA and things like that. But historically, it's kind of been the terminology of risk assessment process, threat identification process. So you kind of have to divine the tea leaves a little bit to build out your program. But effectively, just like it's always been in financial regulatory regimes, it's up to the bank to define the language. That's why most regulations are fairly generic, because they want you to move in the right direction, but they don't want to be told what to do because it's a private business. However, they can come in and say, you're absent a risk identification process because you're not doing threat modeling, you're not doing pen testing, you're not even reviewing things even after production if there's a vulnerability. So that generally is a failure and a cause for consent orders and things like that. Now, what's happening in the US with those, there's other entities that kind of broaden. In New York, they have a new legislative regulation that affects anybody that really does business in New York, but it's financial insurance and it has teeth, and they've already levied massive fines to lots of people. So in the US, things are starting to happen. I'm not sure how far that would take it. I mean, like FDA has also been very prescriptive about what threat modeling is and what the process is for devices. But in financial side, what they've really come down into is threat modeling is important. The process of where it exists, how it exists, and what it is connected to, meaning I don't just threat model something and drop a report. I give it to the risk management process, which is a defined handover. They actively take action on that and process it as they normally would any other risk to the bank. And that is deemed the bar now. No longer can you just, I ran a tool or I paid somebody that's unqualified to do this, and that's it. That's my process. You can't do that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there are two threads I want to pull on there to get into more detail. But before we do that, do have a question in the chat here, because we've been using the terms kind of interoperably, saying, you know, financial services and banking. And the question is there a difference between the process of threat modeling when it comes to banks specifically and other financial institutions like you know, a Robinhood or an online trading platform and so on, or is it all controlled by kind of the same regulatory mandates?
I think you have when you are part of a financial service or support to a financial service, you have at least the PCI DSS, which governs all when it comes to payment services. Doesn't matter if you're a bank or another type of transactional provider. But financial services also includes, for instance, insurance companies. So they all have to follow the same overarching rules and regulations. And they are now more and more being governed, maybe not directly by the same. So you have the central bank and the insurance. Actually, I don't know that anymore. But it's now more being consolidated and follow the same acts, as in like the DORA Act. And so everything comes out of the same laws and regulations, and they govern financial institutions. And a bank is a financial institution, and these are also, like Robinhood is also a financial institution, need to comply.
Yeah. And in the US, there's a levels of financial institutions, or like I say, there's a foreign bank operating in the US. They have their own special designation and therefore have different types of requirements. When in context of threat modeling, Robinhood does trading where other financial institutions might not do trading. So they will fall under FINRA and other regulators. And that comes with, it's repetitive. I mean, nobody's really unique from a regulator perspective. It's just, it gets more targeted. So banks who don't trade or hedge funds that don't actually transact, they don't really have much of a compliance regime because it's not required. But banks who trade or transact or have customers where there's, you know, a ledger that they need to maintain, those are all things that they fall into a category where they have the higher bar, meaning they must threat model, they must have this risk identification process. So you mentioned Robinhood versus, let's say JP Morgan. JP Morgan is a full suite, and they're critical infrastructure in multiple countries. So they fall under all the requirements. And they have wealth management, and they have a hedge fund. They have it all. So they fall under it. Robinhood transacts. They are making a foray into retirement and other things like that. So they are going to pick up more regulatory responsibility. But for the most part, they have less than a JP Morgan, but more than, let's say, a savings and loan, you know, smaller bank, because all they're really doing is just ledger, like savings and loans type stuff.
So it feels like more based on the products that they support and supply. Yeah, that is the same as in Europe. So even though the source would be, you know, these overarching European acts, they are described as in, if you are a certain type of institution, then these apply. Yeah, that's definitely true.
And how about, so, you know, these regulations are saying that you need to do this thing called threat modeling or threat assessment, or you know, whatever they call the activity, this kind of, you know, proactive identification of risk and threats. How about how you do it. Would there be differences in how you perform this threat modeling activity if you were in a bank or you're not? Or is it pretty much the same kind of activity, but slightly different or identical?
I think for Europe, the key that has come up is the proactive and early in the, so that in the design phase, in the design state, that at that time you have to do a threat analysis and a risk analysis. And what you see that has happened in the past is that usually after design, they will do the threat and risk analysis and then pick up, okay, we are compliant or not compliant, and otherwise refactor. That is a process that was accepted in the past, as in, okay, if you're not compliant, then we go back a step. They don't accept that anymore. They want you to have a process in the beginning of your development cycle, whether it's a process or an application, that you do your threat and risk analysis. And just a risk analysis, even though it's, when we say risk analysis as linked to business risk, as in we're losing money and customers are, they also want you to have a proper threat analysis. As soon as they see you don't have that, they will, with the risk of opening up too much, I mean, you will get an audit item and say, okay, where is your threat landscape? We see you cover your risks, but where's the, let's say, the link between the threats that you introduce and the risks that you have identified? If you can't show that, then you have an item. And this is why threat modeling early on is a fit, is a very specific fit.
Yeah, from the scale of things, now since I'm consulting on my own with multiple different customers, I'm finding that even in regulated industry, non-financial, it's different. Financial, I think, because they're usually very aggressive in regulatory action. Yeah. Banks have to move quickly to build process and program to get out from underneath any fines or regulatory action. That doesn't mean you have to start out with full maturity and don't launch something until it's just perfect. Do something, because if you show effort and that you're making progress, you're gonna be in a lot better place with a regulator than, well, it's just not done, so we've not done anything. That's not going to be a good excuse. And so I guess the answer is starting out doing something. And so really, like, stride. Everybody knows stride. Doing a stride effort is great. You're starting to ask questions. You're starting to build a structure, a process, and you're starting to understand what your systems actually look like. You will need to mature past that and start to use other methods and start to integrate and go into deeper detail rather than just assumptions of threats because of data flows and drawings. So all I'm saying is start somewhere and build towards a higher maturity. Other industries might not need to go much further than that because really they don't have the obligation to. And anything they do would only be for the benefit of themselves and their customers and the information that they store on their customers.
Oh, making it a unique selling point, actually. Yeah, and what I also found is that even though you start, like you mentioned, in the basics, like stride, and but do it end to end. So not just have a threat model and go like, okay, threat model done, next. Make sure that you also show you did something with the results of a threat model. You picked up, or you improved, you revert back to the model with your implemented countermeasures, reassessed. If you have that cycle, that continuous cycle, that will show. That is more value that I noticed than having a very mature threat model and not being picked up afterwards.
So that's a really, I think that's a really interesting topic, Jeroen. I'm glad you brought it up because threat modeling doesn't exist in its own bubble. Particularly in financial services organizations, you need to get it integrated into GRC, into other tools like the GRC platforms like Archer or ServiceNow. Could we talk a bit more about how do you plug threat modeling into other teams and to other processes?
Yeah, the first opportunity, I mean, we will force is a big word, but we had the opportunity to put a lot of effort in creating a lot of threat models and also picking up let's say the results out of tasks And immediately when you talk about tasks as a basis of these are the countermeasures from a threat, you also need to have some form of escalation when is a task not picked up. So immediately you sort of organically flow into issue and risk management and try to hook in to those processes when let's say a task SLA is being breached or something like that, okay, what do we do then? How do we make sure that the right organizational entities within the bank actually pick it up and say something intelligent about it, or that more effort or more time is being assigned to a task, or that a risk is accepted but at least documented. So that was the first natural flow for us. And then the second part was the assurance. So when do we know that a countermeasure or a task has been performed correctly? So you look at assurance testing and reporting, like pen testing, but also unit testing and code testing, and then revert back. Okay, we had a threat, we had a countermeasure, we've implemented that countermeasure, and we also know that we've done it correctly because here, look, we had a pen tester look at our environment and specifically did this test on this vulnerability, and now it's fixed. So when we started doing this, we also found the need to, as Jason mentioned, to evolve the maturity of the product. It was not just okay, we have a nice get together with the DevOps team. We'll talk about threats and risk, and nobody made a mistake, and how you can improve your application as into, okay, we need to have a structured, repeatable capability that has some automation and not only depending on the knowledge of the people in the room at that time, because no matter how good you are, well, unfortunately, most of us, and especially not me, have a perfect memory. So you forget about certain vulnerabilities, threats, risk, paths. I mean, MITRE, I understand most of it, but by heart and on point every time you do a discussion on a specific UI, doesn't happen. So you need some help there, and then you start to realize that, and then you start to slowly evolve your methodology and your tooling and your documentation, opening it up to further integration, and that's sort of the let's say the evolutionary cycle you run into. But it starts with doing it end to end and hooking it into other processes. Exactly, making sure that it's picked up. Yeah,
I agree with you on that. Just to continue on that thought, the globals, the larger banks, are going to be unique in that they have funding and a requirement.
Yeah.
Where most other companies, they may have the funding, but do they have the requirement? So do they want to invest into developing this process, buying the tooling, so forth and so on? So when I was at my prior role before my running my own company, I had architecture and threat modeling, which was a really great position to be in, because as we were just talking about, the outputs and inputs into threat modeling need to have a symbiotic relationship. They need to benefit the overall process. So really, when it comes down to things, banks need to show a low administrative cost for their customers. And so introducing a new process automatically increases admin cost. It increases time to market, potentially. So this integration and tooling and things like that will actually reduce time to market. And as you get more throughput, because your process starts to be more adopted and efficient, you will reduce your admin cost overall. And that is something that I spent a lot of time having to document and prove. And I conclusively proved the point, to the point where the business is like, we believe you, so we'll fund you more people to get this going. So that is something I really want to highlight. So the tooling, that last part, the risk registry, or just the ability to have a central store of this.
Yeah.
Real quickly, I'll point out to where that ties out to. I said I was over architecture and threat modeling. So your ARB process, I had to refine that. Good information in means good information out. So now when I threat model, I will define actually what this bit of architecture, this solution, this application really looks like at a detailed level. This is typically the first time that is ever known. But now, since I've created that, store that in a tool, put it out into a repo next to the code for that solution, As
Yeah.
things change in that solution, it goes back to my tool and says, this has changed. You need to go look at that again. So that's one massive improvement, moving at the pace of code. Then I've threat modeled this. Engineering, DevOps follows on and builds the solutions. That's code. That gets tested, evaluated, proven to be good. That goes into a repository with your controls. Now you know what you have to fix things and what those mitigations are. That's great from a memory help assistance, but it's also tie that into your developer's process. So when they're developing something, it just goes, wait, we've already done this and it's approved, done. And that's why things start to speed up and your admin cost starts to come down. This continues on through SOC, and this continues on through your pipeline deployments, same types of concepts. So speed increases, admin cost goes down.
Yeah. That is future for us, and that's the future that I want to move into. So this is brilliant stuff. Writing my roadmap for next year.
How about the you mentioned kind of the level of detail that you go into in a threat model. It tends to be very kind of technical detail. When you need to integrate with your risk teams, is there a translation that needs to happen between these are my threats at a technical level and this is what my risk team needs to know? Or is it a one-for-one, every threat becomes a risk with an assigned risk rating to it? Or do you tend to try and use a different level of abstraction when you talk about risk?
Little bit of both. You need to bring it into the threat model. Otherwise, if you don't have that hook somewhere, you will not be able to build that relationship later on. Also, a lot of the severities of a threat, the impact of how bad is a thing if the thing happens, that needs to be related to the business itself. If you don't do that, then the severity will just be like the CWE CAPEX severity, which will be attested every time. So every time you go, even in the olden days when we did a pen test, the pen test would go like, this has a high severity, and then the owner would go like, what do you mean high severity? The data is public, so what if everybody sees it? I don't care. And it's the context that needs to be added as well. So what we tend to do is actually add those assets to the threat model. So the typical assets of that makes that application important for the business is added to it, and we give it a weight. So that would also be taken into account to the priority setting of the countermeasure itself and relate to it. It would also give the opportunity so it works the other way around as well, the opportunity for the development team or the owner of the application to say, I don't want to follow this rule for now. Because, yes, there's a rule and we fall within the category that this rule applies for, but not yet, not this iteration, because we don't have these assets in our environment yet or unlock this functionality just yet. So we'll accept it for now and we'll pick it up later. So it will give them a better informed decision if you bring it in at the level of threat modeling. And it will allow the roll up into bigger business risks later on that much easier. Yeah, make that much easier.
The defined process of how do you translate technical to business risk, because ultimately at a bank they have a definition of what business risk means. It's been defined for years, and your regulators know what it is, and if you get away from that, you're in trouble. So you create that mapping, and that will help not only from let's say you have second line defense being ORM, operational risk management. They're typically the second line defense team. They are going to need a direct translation so that they can quickly move you through the process. Now, this is separate from the technical backend. Let's say IriusRisk is the tool, right? And I identify my threats, I put in all the details, and I come up with my external scores, my CAPEX, my CWE, whatever. I need to translate that quickly to whatever my bank high, medium, low is. And that is what is brought to second line. I have defined how my decision process, and they evaluate it over time and say, you know what, you're consistent in how you're doing your mapping. We trust you. This can move through quickly. And that's where the APIs from IriusRisk to whatever tooling I'm using, let's say Archer, can just happen. And
Yeah.
that's where you've now integrated into your business risk process. And that is critical to move things and integrate into your bank rather than just, I'm doing threat modeling over here as a project.
No, yeah, no, you can't do without. As an example, we are in the transition of moving from a manual way of doing threat modeling. Yes, we did it very structured, but we're still manual into using a tool. And part of the MVP is actually that mapping. We have to put that in because if a task doesn't have a severity that means something also to issue a risk management processes down the line, then you can't speed up. It doesn't hit home. Also, the priority of the task doesn't make sense to whoever needs to pick that up or look at it for further assessment. It also doesn't allow for high overviews of whole chains of applications in a big product like payments or loans, which is a lot of these applications working together. And if you can't see the overall posture of it on in risk language, business risk language, quick, then you lose again that time that you won with the DevOps teams doing all these translations and additional analyses. So as MVP, you need to do this. You need to have that in, so to speak. Yeah.
I think most most people are familiar with doing threat modeling manually, and as you guys have been mentioning tooling here. When do you think a company should consider, like, what is kind of the tipping point for them to say, okay, we now need to consider using some automated tooling to help us with the threat modeling journey, or we keep doing it manual? Like, what are the kind of things that would make them choose to go the tooling route?
For us, it was easy. It was a little bit twofold. One, we had to do a lot of threat models because of compliance and show lineage. But the other one is the integration. If you change the positioning of threat modeling from this is a nice awareness tool to teach the teams to work together with CISOs and understand security in their application, into out of this functionality come requirements that you have to use to improve your application. As soon as that starts to happen, no matter what the trigger is, then you need to have a repeatable and consistent process and also documentation, and that immediately needs a tool that will help you with that and enforce it. Could be a simple tool, but as soon as you start to integrate, because everybody wants to automate, the backlogs and the management of tasks, and then you need to have a proper tool that provides that for you. Yes. So when it goes from awareness to activity and let's say a cyclic process, then tooling. For us, that was it.
Yeah. For me, process. Get your process defined. Know what you have to do and know what works for you and where your pain points are, because it's at your pain points of where the tooling is going to solve your problems, because your tooling is not going to design your process and execute it for you. So the scaling, consistency, automation, and orchestration, those are going to be really important. So when we're just talking about integrating into the compliance tooling, that API calls and stuff like that is going to save you immense hours and just make everything better for your life. So that's a tool. The repository of the drawings with the associated threats to tie into architecture process, or the calls from your repos to say things have changed and it notifies your project. That's a tooling solution, but the process is really important. The other thing, a different thought on this is, I was just working with a global, one of my customers now, and I said, you're going to want a tool eventually, but let's just get this process built. And we're doing it like, I don't know if we really need a tool. I'm like, we've done 2 threat models. I'm storing these in SharePoint and another whatever tool. It's an Atlassian tool. And I go, who's going to read these? And who knows where these are? And how are you going to make this thing aware of that thing? And they're like, oh, I see your point. That is just a real life example of why and when do you need a tool.
But you have to
Yeah.
show it, right? You
Yeah.
really have to show it, because they won't take you, because it's the same process. They won't take your word from it. They really have to see it and also understand. You've done 3 threat models, so we did 55 very quickly with different people doing those threat models. And I just showed them, okay, look at the differences on how these threats and countermeasures are described. And they were going like, yeah, wait, hang on. How do we make sure that we don't have an overlap or a mismatch? Or it's like, yeah, how do you do that? That's a fair question. You know, there's a tool for that. You know, it's basically how that went. Yeah, but you have to
And
show.
I think, and I think there are also advantages just to having the data in a structured format. So if you had the threat models, no matter how they were done, but you had them in a database that could be queried, and you could say, well, I've now done hundreds of threat models. What's the top threat that keeps coming up and we keep having to implement a mitigation for? And how do we solve that systematically in the organization, rather than every engineering team having to go and reinvent the wheel and solve the problem on their own. Yeah, we got another question from the in the chat here, a bit of a long one, so I'll just go through the key points. That threat modeling program can be helpful, but often developers and product owners see it as a roadblock, and they see it as a time-consuming activity. And they often view threats as imaginary or not applicable, making it hard to get buy-in there. And the question is, Subha Ganesan says he has found that security control-driven approach more effective than just identifying tons of threats. Would the fact, if you just went for a more of a control-based approach, would this be considered an effective threat modeling approach for regulators in financial services?
Yeah, so for us, no, that was the case. That no, they didn't. In the past, yes, we could get away with it. It's not a nice way of saying it, but yes, we could get away with it because they didn't know better either. Once you open up to the need for threat intelligence in your environment, which financial institutions need to have, as soon as that happens, they want to understand, okay, where does this apply in your organization? Where can these type of hacker groups that are now being extremely active and are targeting banks, where would that happen with you? And then the control doesn't work anymore, because it can only show you the control, but you have to, if you need to refer that back to the actual threat, then you're already threat modeling. So why not start in the beginning? I mean, there's no silver bullet, right? I mean, it's not just having the controls should fix it, or just having threat modeling should fix it. I think it's a combination of both. Because having these controls in place, I mean, the controls are there not only to prove that you've thought about how to fix those threats, but also have something that's measurable. So you can, at any point, give the status of a control throughout your organization. And that is very valuable for oversight and regulators. But how the decisions are being made, whether or not the control should be applied, and at what time it is mandatory to apply a control, it is not just a rule. You should have the situation at the time in the organization that the application and the process and the product is running in, and that will allow for well-informed decisions. You can't plug every hole. You just don't have the time, the effort, the money. It just can't be done. So, and they understand this. Regulators understand this. So on one point, they understand you have these controls, but they also understand that you can't apply them everywhere. So you need to make, they always like these risk-based decision. Yeah, what risk and which threats. And if you can't show that, then you have a problem. And they will actually ask you and force you to do this, to have this upfront and have this in place. At least that's what happened with us. Luckily, we were a little bit ahead of them and already in the process. So, it was an easy fix. Yeah, so controls, important. Policies, standards, important, definitely. Especially financial institutions can't do without them. Combine them with threat modeling, and it really is a golden combination. It leverages and complements both, actually.
Yeah, I'm not going to take on the compliance versus security argument of that type of question. I'll provide an example of where you can get threat intelligence, because sometimes the really advanced stuff, like state-sponsored attack type threat intelligence, is expensive. And is it really what is your most critical thing to work on. Threat intelligence can be someone else is doing threat modeling on cloud services, and you could buy that and consume it, and it can accelerate your process. And that's identifying threats for you.
Yeah.
Your SOC is identifying threats all day long, every day. Aggregate that data, sort it by the types of attacks that you might identify, and say, we're actually seeing these attacks against our infrastructure, and I know it exists across these application systems, whatever. That is your priority or your risk-based decision. That is what your regulator is going to appreciate, because it's not just, wow, look at that. You know, North Korea is doing this really cool new attack against containers. Have you seen it? Do you even run containers? No. Well, then why are you wasting time researching it? Like, clearly you're being attacked over here on password attempts and phishing. So focus on that. That is how to solve the challenge that you're facing right now. And I think that would be a more effective approach for your regulators right now.
Nice one. It's both ways, right? It's from the inside looking to the outside. What should the SOC be focusing on? What should the threat intelligence team scouring the dark web with whatever kind of AI to make sense of the posts focus on and pick up and be alerted about? And the other one is, okay, what is very popular? So what are the popular attacks now emerging because something happened, some event happened, like a war in Europe, or you know that which could spark the elevation of certain countermeasures that need to be implemented of threats that we have found. So it's making your response a little bit more dynamic, but having a control there, making sure that you can measure it, making sure that you have a standard, that helps. But do test the standard as well. You know, does this still work? Yeah.
We got a related question that came in asking, how have you overcome adoption challenges or general resistance from teams to doing threat modeling?
Audit. Oh, sorry, no, I didn't. Get an audit on. No, so funnily enough, when you do a threat model with a team, no matter if you do it manually, they're always interested, because it's at once you get that time and they're in the room, you know, they go like, okay, I need to be here, so let's just go for it. And once you start going through that application and see how it can be exploited, and they feel like, oh, this is really exciting stuff. And you know, I haven't looked at it this way. Oh, this is a real eye opener. So that really helps. Now, that is an emotion that you need to cultivate. That helped. Of course, it also helps to make sure that the process of threat modeling itself, at least for us, it helped to make it more of a self-service model. They can start a threat model, or will be able to start a threat model at any time, you know, kick it off. They understand how to create the data flow diagram or the architectural drawing, and then, hey, press a button and here there are threats and countermeasures related to our controls. That immediately, just to give them that upfront also helped, because linking it into, if you do this, you will be compliant, and you know this when you start planning your application. Yeah, opened up a whole new avenue of them of prioritization and where to put the focus, and also be able to tell to, you know, CISO as in, yeah, we've done it, we got it, don't worry, you know, go away, let me do my job. That helped as well. You know, make them a demander instead of a recipient of, you need to do this, kind of, but sort of a demander towards CISO as in, do you have a product for this, because I need to fix this threat. Empower them.
Another approach, positive approach I've had to use is do the work for them, because as you're trying to bring essentially new work to people, they're naturally going to be resistant, because I don't have enough people, I don't have enough time, I don't have the education to do this, whatever the reason may be, they will be resistant. Understand what you're asking of them and what their process is and what their output is, and do that for them. Yeah. Show them this is what can be done using this process for you, and this could save you this much time. It could standardize your process, things like that. And once they see it, that is where you'll start to get better adoption. People like, well, okay, how do I do that then? And
Exactly.
that's the conversation you want to have, rather than threat modeling is great, you should do it.
No, true. No, you have to demo it. You have to, and even if you do it for them, show them, bring somebody along and do it in the way that they would do it. So don't have a user that can do more in a tool or see more than they just, run it through the tool, click away, and then they will actually say, hey, I can do this as well. Hang on. And suddenly they just start to nudge you over the way from the keyboard. And what if I do this kind of a response? I've seen that actually happening, especially when you bring in tooling. The manual, not so much. They really want you to be, do the documentation. They like the talking, just not documenting. But as soon as there is a tool and they can do this without having to speak to anyone themselves, that also helps, because they can just play around, see the results, and not have a sort of a confrontational response as in, well, you should really fix this kind of, because no matter what happens, you can tell them many times, no mistakes were made, we're here to improve. They still will feel like, yeah, but I should have actually already done this requirement. And then they can see it for themselves and then sort of, okay, but now I haven't even built it yet, so I'm good. But do it for them first. First demo it. Show the results a couple of times before you let them loose. Yeah, true.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because there's often this misconception, I think, that engineers don't want to do security because it's extra work for them. But I've been talking to engineers. These are craftspeople. They want to have pride in the thing that they've created, and I think very few engineers will deliberately go and create non-performant software or bad quality software. And security just sometimes slips through the cracks because they're just not very familiar with the terminology, with what attackers could do. But as you say, if you kind of open their eyes to this is what could happen if you don't do it, they're like, yeah, sure. We do want to build those security controls, and we do want to create good quality and secure applications and secure code.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wanted to just touch on you mentioned the word AI, Jeroen, so I'm going to blame you for opening the door. A lot of financial services firms, as all companies, are now building applications using AI, and they're incorporating AI. What do you guys think is the role of threat modeling of AI systems? Is it something new and different? Is it the same kind of threat modeling, just with a new technology, or what are your opinions on that?
Yeah, yes and no. So of course, I mean, that's a whole other, again, workshop and dialogue. So we've had machine learning, especially in financial institutions, for a long time. You can't go through every payment or transaction to see if it's money laundering or fraud. So you have to have, some form of machine learning and alerting system around that. Well, the major difference that I see when I look at doing a threat model on an environment that has an AI deployed on it or uses, is that there's not much difference between, the training and the development of the AI and the production environment. It sort of blends in because you train it with live data. Otherwise, you don't know if it really works. So that's a scary thing. So that's an additional dimension that you need to take into account when you do a threat model of an AI. But if you have, the process is the same. So we are still going to approach it the same. So it uses specific technology, has a specific use case and functionality. And that will, how do you say this, introduce certain type of threat in your environment. You need to figure out how to handle those threats, and you need to weigh them, and you need to understand them. So overall, threat modeling would be the same. Process would be the same, just as you said, different type of technology and functionality. Threat modeling with AI, that's a different thing altogether. But that's next question.
Yeah, that's another webinar. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we have time to respond to that, or do you want to move on?
You got 5 minutes, Jason. Go for it.
Yeah.
Real quick. AI right now is augmentation, not replacement. It doesn't perform the whole function. So creating your documents in a standard way writing the responses in a common language, so you're not saying different results for the same threat. Taking in content and structuring it, things like that. The second thing on this is, Jorn is right. Financial industry has been using machine learning for decades. It's not a new technology. AI, or the concept of AI, is also not that new. However, for some reason, the financial industry specifically treats security data differently than they do financial data. So I think that needs to there needs to be something written or put out there of this is how you do this in the financial industry. So policy, standards, risks, threats can be consumed by an AI model in a way that is compliant and consistent, that financial data has been used in this method, so that we can actually move forward. Because everybody's struggling. They see this as difficult, hard, expensive, whatever. AI can help tremendously. It's not going to be the silver bullet, but it will help tremendously reduce the automation or orchestration so that you can reduce your admin cost. And that is all I'll say on that for right now.
Super. Thanks, guys. We've got literally 4 minutes left, and we've got 2 questions in the chat. I don't want to leave our participants hanging with unanswered questions. Very quickly, question number 1, how threat modeling is implemented in healthcare industry? A bit off topic, but while we're here, why don't we have a stab at it?
I've spent 7 years at a healthcare provider, a large insurer in the US, and I built the vulnerability management program there, still in effect today. And that was almost 20 years ago, 20-some plus years ago. So the concept is not new, and the process is not new. The requirement is somewhat new, but it has teeth. And so in the US, healthcare gets fines. And if you lose patient data, and a lot of the larger insurance providers have government contracts, which have clawbacks in the contracts. So if you don't do these things, you're not showing sufficient due diligence towards threat identification and remediation, you get fined or clawbacks in your contracts. So it's serious. It's like finance. It's just a different industry.
Yeah.
Super.
For the US, it's the whole HIPAA that is really and not that much experience on how this is being done within the healthcare industry. I do know that when it comes to HIPAA and GDPR, they are applied. So when it says that you need to upfront do anything kind of threat and risk analysis on that, sensitive data, yeah, they will have a form of threat analysis. But I don't have enough. Maybe I should actually look it out. Could be interesting.
The new regulator in New York is the one that's really causing all this stir in the US right now, because they're issuing a ton of fines to people.
And of course, there's the FDA that now requires threat modeling for medical devices, which is a different and separate regulatory environment there. We've got 1 minute to go. Unfortunately, we can't get to the last unanswered question. So we'll wrap it up here. Jeroen and Jason, I can't thank you enough for joining us on this webinar. It's been a great discussion. It's been great to have you on here. And thanks to everybody for joining. We will make the recording available as well. And thank you again. And we'll see you next time.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.